longer capable of reading their own aliyah from the Torah, a designated Baal Koreh was appointed to read, while the person who received the aliyah continued to recite the brachos. What was the reason for this takana? So the Rosh mentions two possible reasons. To have a Baal Koreh, to avoid embarrassing those who do not know how to read properly, and to ensure that one who does want to read, but does not know how to read properly, even if he thinks he does, is unable to do so, and then the people will not be Yotzei Kriyas Torah. However, the Rosh points out that the person receiving the aliyah must still read the text from the Torah together with the Baal Koreh, right? He has to read the text together with the Baal Koreh, since otherwise his bracha on the Torah would be considered bracha levatala. Says the Rosh in Megillah there. Umasha nagu ha'idna. Says the Rosh, now that which we have accustomed today, sheshliach tzibur koreh, that we have a shaliach who reads the Torah, hainu shelo levaishes mi she'eino yodea likros, not to embarrass someone who does not know how to read. Kidisnan, Gabi, Bikurim, it's the same thing. There you have to read a parsha. Betchila mish yodea likros koreh. Where, there's a parsha of Arami Oved Avi that you have to read, called Vidu Bikurim, when you brought the Bikurim. So there also it says, B'tchila mish yodea likros koreh, people who knew how to read could read it. Mish ani yodea likros makrin or so, they would sort of read it for him. People started, because of embarrassment, Nimnu Mlavi Machmas Abusha. Hiskinu Shiyu Makrin Sakol. So they made a takana that a Baal Koreh would read it. However, says the Rosh, Ena Dimyu Nirali, he says that's not a good comparison. The Hasam Nimnu Mlavi Bikurim. There, the embarrassment led to people not to bring their Bikurim, and therefore Avra Mashakosov B'Torah. And that's over a doraisa bringing bikurim. Aval hacha bikin yikru v'acherim yimnu u'makmas abusha yitnu lev lilmod parsha. Here you can't say the same svara. You'll still have an expert reading it, and if they're embarrassed, they will just learn how to read it better. So the Rosh doesn't like the tam of embarrassment as to be shayach to this issue of why we have a Baal Koreh. Not everybody knows the trop. And therefore, if somebody reads improperly, the tzibur will not be yotzei. Somebody goes up, thinks that he knows how to read, but he doesn't really know how. And it might even lead to fights in shul, because if you don't let him read, because the people are worried they're not going to be yotzei, well, it's going to lead to upset feelings. So therefore, to avoid all of this, just like by a milah, so the chiyuv of milah is on the father. Well, today most people don't have that ability to do milah. So they appoint a baki, they appoint an expert to do it. It's really the same thing, says the Rosh, when it comes to kriyas hatzibur. When we call makom gama oimed likros, yikra benachas uvediktuk im shliach tzibur. That's why there's a minig when you get an aliyah, you have to read along with the Baal Koreh. You have to do it quietly. Shalotei bracha levatala. You made a bracha of Birchas Torah. If you don't read Torah words, it's going to be a bracha levatala. The also sheni yodea likros, somebody who cannot read along with the Baal Koreh. So in roy shikru shliach tzibur, vavi bracha levatala v'lo mistaber shu yivarchal kriyas shliach tzibur. Basically, you shouldn't give him an aliyah. It would be a bracha levatala. And it doesn't make sense that he's making a bracha on behalf of the Baal Koreh. So the Rosh says somebody who can't read along with the Baal Koreh probably better not to be called up. Now, we are going to learn tonight the development of the halacha, which leads us to how we handle ourselves in shul today. But this clearly was the opinion of the Rosh. The Rosh mentions the same conclusion in his Chuvas, that one receiving the Aliyah must read along with the Balkorei. So what we just read was the Rosh's commentary on Gemara in the back of every Masechta. So the back of Masechta Megillah, there's a Rosh. That Rosh explains sugyas and ends up oftentimes giving a final halacha. However, there were also Chuvas HaRosh. By the way, Yaakov Yellen, who's one of our participants, and I visited Toledo, Spain, and the Rosh lived in Toledo and did a lot of his writing in Toledo, Spain. It's a beautiful walled city. Our tour guide, Professor Mark Shapiro, read us a lot of Chuvas HaRosh when we visited Toledo. And similarly, when we were in Barcelona, where the Rashba was, we learned a lot of Chuvas HaRashba. So the Rosh was operating in Spain for a significant portion. He had moved down from France and Germany during that period of time, and was accepted as the Gadol Hador in Spain, in Toledo, and that's where the Chuvas HaRosh were written. So the Chuvas says, Ubur, that means somebody who doesn't know how to read, Likros B'Torah and Davar Hagun. That's not appropriate. Because once he makes a bracha, Tzarech Sheyikra, he has to read something. Shlotei bracha v'atola. Omnam im kori machazin. If he reads along with the Balkar of Yodei Lahavim, if he understands l'chaber artiyos and reads it carefully, l'kroisa machazin, make rishaper kriya. So that's good kriya. Alfa shivorchu amashachazim kori v'hu lo yikra klal lo yitachin klal. And the Rosh supports his position from a Tosefta that states that if only one person knows how to read the Torah, that person should receive all of the 7 aliyos. The Rosh points out that had it been permitted for the others to recite the bracha and listen to the Balkorah read, that would have been preferable to one person receiving all the aliyos. Based on the fact that the Tosefta says that if nobody else knows how to read, the Balkorah gets all 7 aliyos, the Rosh inferred from there that you must read along with the Balkorah when receiving an aliyah, otherwise it's a bracha levatala. So the Rosh in the same, in Megillah there, quotes a Tosefta, B'nei HaKnesset she'ein mi sheyikra, in a shul where there's no Balkorah. Ela echad oimed v'koreh v'yoshev v'oimed v'koreh v'yoshev v'oimed v'koreh v'yoshev. The same guy, he is called up each time. Kor v'yoshev 7 times, that's considered being called up for the aliyah. Afilu shiva pamim. V'zeh abimeyem. That was in the times of the Tanoim. Sha'arishon mevarach bracha rishona. V'chosem mevarach bracha achrona. Right? Where the guy, the Balkorah here, who's getting 7 aliyahs, would not recite 7 brachas. This is during the time where the first bracha was said before the first aliyah, and the last bracha was said after the last aliyah. That's why he has to sit and then stand up again, so people will realize that we had 7 different aliyos. But now, where the meaning is to say the bracha before and after each aliyah, could go on Kohen, Shekar b'mokom Levi, Ein Tzarech Leishev. Now, when you call up a Kohen and there's no Levi, and the Kohen recites the bracha of the Levi, b'mkom Levi, he doesn't have to sit down because we don't have this concern that we won't know that it's a different aliyah. So, the Rosh wonders, how did it be that the shul didn't have somebody to lame? First of all, you have to have a minion. The case must have been nobody else knew how to read, and it was one guy who read. And says the Rosh, Zui Raya Lamasha Kasafti Le'el, that's proof to what I said before. Somebody who doesn't know how to read along with the Chazan, with the Balkoreh, he should not be called up Aliyah. Davi Brach Levatola. If it would have worked for the one who was ola to make brachas, and all he has to do is listen to the Balkorei, then why didn't they allow that to happen? Why did they have to have the same guy get called 7 times? So the Rosh is pounding the nail on the head who holds that if you can't read along with the Balkorei, he should not be called up for an aliyah. This is also the opinion of the Rashba, who writes that if a Kohen does not know how to read, he should not receive the first aliyah, and it should be given to a Yisrael who knows how to read. These are also in the Truvas of the Rashba. Sha'alta al kohen ha'aretz, a kohen who's unlearned. Sheni yodeh likros, vein be'er kohen zulason. He's the only kohen in the city. Imutu Yisrael likros betor lefon of him lav. So is it better for Yisrael to be called up instead of him? So tshuva dvarim elu pshutim heim shemuter v'roi u'machuyev. He says not only is it allowed to, it's a chova. You must do it that way. He doesn't know how to read. How will he make the bracha and read? Adarab asrlo. It's prohibited. Sharei mevarch levatala. V'lo eliminadin kohen shein chacham Yisrael chacham karim lo. He says the general rule that we give kadima to a kohen, but that's only if there's a Talmid Chacham. A Talmid Chacham should go before a Kohen. Kiramin Rav Krobekani, right? Rav, the Amoira Rav, would take the Kohen Aliyah. Chenamru minayin leger Talmid Chacham. Even a Talmid Chacham who's a convert, who of course doesn't have any yichus, shekodim lekohen gadol ha'aretz, right? He gets the Aliyah before a Kohen Gadol who is unlearned. Shenamar Yikra Yikarahi mipninim. Yikari mikohen gadol shenichtas leflaiv lifnim. Chazal darshan that a Talmid Chacham is more beloved to me, even than a Kohen Gadol who goes in lifnai v'lifnim.
Why don't you say Shemer Koina?
Oh, very good. So right now we've developed the sheet of the Rosh and the Rashba and the Tur that obviously are not relying on Shomei Koina. But we're going to see, that means if Shomei, hearing something is as if you said it, then a person who made the Aliyah doesn't know how to read, but hears it from the Balkorei should be okay. There's no bracha levatala. But obviously, the Rosh does not learn that Shomei Koina works here. We'll have to understand why. And
I think it may, it's interesting. I saw the Shomei Koina also in the one by the blind person. It may have something to do with how the person reads, because, the Rosh, interestingly, says it, and he says it a little further again, benachas. He doesn't say belachash. I don't think he means that the person reads it quietly. He actually reads it along with the Balkorei. He reads it lower, but he actually reads it along with him. And that's why Shomei Koina is difficult, because according to the Rosh, I think he actually has to read it with the Balkorei. He doesn't say it quietly. He says it softly, but you have to hear him too, so that you actually hear two voices. That's what he may mean, and I guess we'll see more of him.
Right. So the question will be, normally when we invoke Shomei Koina, for example, there's an apple in front of me, and a person next to me makes a bracha, boyer priya eitz, and I hear it, and I say amen, or we have kavod, even without amen, I hear the bracha. I can eat the fruit even though I didn't enunciate the bracha myself. So the principle of Shomei Koina seems to work that it's as if I recited the bracha. So Yaakov now is pointing out to us that it could be that because there's an inyan of kriya, that Shomei Koina won't work. We'll have to see why does the Rosh reject using Shomei Koina? Obviously they do, and he says yes, you have to read it benachas, and carefully with the Baal Koreh. And we'll have to, so that's, the question is, why doesn't Shomea Ka'ona work?
Ernie, do you remember that when Herschel Schachter came to our show a couple of times, I think you were laning that he was saying it with you, Belachash?
When I get called up, when I lane, excuse me, I read it along with the Baal Koreh, the Lachash.
Yeah, but, right. I'm just saying Herschel Schachter seemed to have, I vaguely recall, but I'm pretty sure that when we've given him aliyahs, he'll read along with the bar car, but he's kind of like saying it low voice.
Yeah, that's the din. We're going to see what the din. That's the din. Me'ikar din, when you're called up, you should read along with the Baal Koreh. A little bit. Yeah, I agree. Yaakov said you do it a little. Try to do it with him, but not too far behind.
Yeah.
And
I think what the Rosh is saying is not belachash. Benachas is not belachash. I think, as we'll see later with the two voices, but I think what the Rosh is saying is actually he reads it so that you can hear him, but lower than the Baal Koreh, but you actually hear two voices. That's why Shomea Ka'ona doesn't work, because you actually have to hear the person who's called up. Because you notice he doesn't say belachash, he says benachas, which is softly. So of course, I think the din is, and we all know.
Where do you see that people have to hear the person who gets the aliyah?
No, but Yaakov, the Shomea Ka'ona that we were dealing, what Yaakov is saying here is it might be a problem for the tzibur to be yotzei through Shomea Ka'ona. We'll have to see in a minute that the tzibur doesn't need Shomea Ka'ona.
Correct.
The tzibur is yotzei once the Baal Koreh reads,
Right.
and they have to hear it. And it's remember, Kriyas HaMegillah is an afkamina, because the din of Kriyas HaMegillah is a din in Kriya. The din of Kriyas HaTzibur every Shabbos is din in Shmiya. So you don't need Shmiya Ka'onet, because you don't need the Onet. Shmiya is enough. So what I was saying is, I thought that Abe was asking, which I think is the question. We've had a problem now that the Rosh has a problem that if the person called up for his aliyah does not know how to read, he's going to have a bracha levatala. However, the question is, if Shomea Ka'ona, he's hearing from the Baal Koreh, it's as if he said it. So why should it be a bracha levatala? The Shomea Ka'ona is on the guy who got called up for the aliyah. Is the issue here.
And what I'm saying is, I think the Rosh is saying something different. I think the Rosh is saying, and this is why Shomea Ka'ona doesn't work for the person called up to the Torah. The Rosh is saying that the person who gets called up has to say it in an audible voice so that the rest of the congregation hears it as well. That's why he says benachas and not belachash, and in fact he says it twice in the
that could be that's the svara. Why in a chanami the Rosh doesn't accept Shomea Ka'ona to satisfy, because he can't use it. He's got to actually enunciate a call to fulfill that. We'll see.
But that's just that it's not a bracha levatala. I mean, the whole purpose of that is he doesn't do a bracha levatala. It has nothing to do with the tzibur. It has nothing to do with it's his problem.
On a practical level, that could be distracting to the Baal Koreh too, if the voice is too loud.
And you will see later that that's why they stopped doing it. But originally, they actually both people read the Shliach Tzibur and the one who's called up.
By the way, Yaakov, I think you need to send an email to Rabbi. Yeah, he's very accessible. I'm talking about Doron Podlashuk, who's one of the translators, because they translated Nachas to say softly, and it may not necessarily be true. You could have a discussion with him. Anyways, the Tur, who of course is the son of the Rosh, right? Yaakov Balat, right? The Yaakov the Balaturim is the Yaakov ben Arosh, and his halacha sefer was the first sefer that was divided into the four halakim of Orach Chaim, Even HaEzer, Yoredeh. Rav Yosef Karo based his Shulchan Aruch on the Tur, and the Tur was the son of the Rosh. So when the Tur in Orach Chaim in Siman Kuf Mem Aleph is dealing with Kriyas HaTorah, He says, "Umasha na goy idna shashatz koire." Says Perush Adoni Avi Arosh Zal, right? My father, the Rosh, explained the Fishena Kol Bekiin B'Tamei Kriya. He explained that the reason why we do the way we do now is because not everybody is expert at reading Kriyas HaTorah. Veinat Tzibur Yotzim B'Kriyaso. If a guy who doesn't read well is going to read, the Tzibur won't be Yotze. V'hu Beinav Kiyodea, right? He takes the second reason of the Rosh. And if they don't call him up to do it, he's going to get upset. So they made the takon of a balkore. So this is the tour, basically taking some of what the Rosh said. He didn't say benachas with the digduk. He took the nachas, right? Here also says read softly. Okay. Now, based on this, a blind person would not be able to be called up to read, according to the Rosh. Because if you can't read, there's other reasons. You could be an Amoritz, you don't know how to read. But a blind person is physically incapable of reading. So what about allowing one who is blind to receive an aliyah based on these sources that we've learned so far tonight, right? So in contrast to these Rishonim, the Maharil writes that one may call to the Torah person who does not know how to read, along with the Balkore, or one who is blind and cannot read from the Torah, even if he knows psukim by heart. So you may call these people. And by the way, the Maharil for us Ashkenazim is one of the major, the Ramah, who always in his posek for us in Shulchan Aruch. If you look at his sources, you can see the Ramah's sources by the Darkei Moshe. The Darkei Moshe was another halacha sefer written by Rav Moshe Isserlis, and in there he goes into depth, similar to the Beis Yosef's commentaries on the Tur, where you can understand a little bit why Rav Yosef Karo paskin a certain way. Rav Yosef Karo writes in Shulchan Aruch, he's very terse, but many times you can go to the Beis Yosef, who is the commentary on the Tur, who was also Rav Yosef Karo, and sort of flesh out based on what Gemaras and Rishonim is Rav Yosef Karo basing his stuff on. Well, it's the same thing in the Ramah. And one of the major sources for Ashkenazic Psak is the Maril, who was in Germany. So says the Maril, Amar Maril Segel, Koin l'Torah Filu Amaretz. So the Maril says you can call somebody who does not read. V'chein asuma, v'lo nahaginan ka'arosh, the posak dasuma lo yikra. We don't paskin like the Rosh, who obviously would have held, based on the svara we learned tonight, that a summa who can't read cannot be called up. Now, the Beis Yosef quotes other Rishonim, such as the Nimuke Yosef and the Aguda, who also permit a blind person to receive an aliyah, even though he cannot follow the Balkor in the text. However, the Beis Yosef himself rules that one should not rely on that opinion. So the Beis Yosef was aware of this opinion, but did not hold like that, held like the Tur and the Rosh, right? The Beis Yosef, in his commentary on the Tur that we just read, the Kuf Mem Aleph there, says that what the Maril said is that look at the cost of the Muke Yosef, B'Shem Sefer Ashkol, did not be Perka Korsa Megillah, Oimed Suma in a Korah B'Torah. That a Suma is not called up. Hainu Loimar De'ena Koral Peh. Can't read by heart. Aval Ukmi Inish Achrina, Shaposech V'Rov Asuma Mavorech, V'Oimed B'Tzido Shapir Dami. Now, but there was a thought that you could put somebody there to see, and the blind person would make the bracha and it would be acceptable. And for example, if Chas v'Shalom, a chassan was blind, that's how they gave him the aliyah. The summa koin kor b'tor. Says the Beis Yosef, ein lismoch al divrayim neged kol hani revusa. We should not rely on these two Rishonim, but we don't rely on those Rishonim we rely on the other poskim that say you can't do it. The Darkei Moshe, who we introduced tonight, which is Rav Moshe Isserlish, but he goes into much more depth. He says, "With my real cost of the Noagin Likros Suman Sefer Torah V'li Nirin Divrei Beis Yosef." So the Darkei Moshe doesn't agree with the Mariel. He is more with the Beis Yosef. So the Shulchan Aruch, Rav Yosef Karu himself ruled, as we suspect, with the Rosh and the Rashba and the Tur. Suma ein a kore. Levisha asr likros afilo asachat shalom naksav. That's a different, it's nothing to do with the bracha of Atola business. It's because you're not allowed to read Torah Shebichsav Bal Peh. And a Suma is going to do that. The Ramah, on the other hand, cites the opinion of the Mariel, despite his preference for the more stringent opinion expressed in Darkei Moshe. The Ramah brings the Mariel. Mariel costs of the Achs of Kore Suma. Kemosha anu makrim b'Torah la'ma'aretz. He says, that's quoting the Mariel. Now, the Mishnah Berurah in our generation, or in the Friedrich generation, explains that the logic behind the opinion of the Mariel and the Ramah who quoted the Mariel is the principle of Shomer Ka'oneh. One who listens to another is considered as if he recited himself. Therefore, if the Ola hears the reading from the Baal Koreh, he is considered to have read it as well, even if he did not read it from the Torah himself. And therefore, there's no bracha levatala if he doesn't read. The Akshav Korasuma of a time of the Kivin She'en Noagim Shashatz Koirei V'hu Koirei Mitoch HaKsav. The Baal Koreh is the one who reads from the text. So we don't care that the one who's called up has to read. Mitoch HaKsav. Shuv lo kabdina al oila de shomer koine. We don't have to worry about all of this because the Ola through Shomer Ka'oneh hears it and it clears up the bracha levatala problem. Consistent with his ruling regarding a blind person, the Shulchan Aruch also rules like the Rosh and the Tur, that a person who's called to the Torah must read along softly with the Baal Koreh, or read it himself if the shul allows him. He says, Lo yikru shnayim. Two people shouldn't read it together. El ha'oila koirei v'shliach tzibur shoisek. He says, if the Ola wants to read, the Baal Koreh should be silent. So here, the Shulchan Aruch is now enunciating the halacha very clearly that the way the Rosh said nachas, the Shulchan Aruch wants him to read more silently, because otherwise it's going to be an interference with the kriya of the Baal Koreh. When we call makom tzarich likros mashatz, but he has to read. He's not relying on Shomer Ka'oneh. Almost to the point where he doesn't hear his voice. Says
Here it's clear. Here it's clear what he says nachas, that means he means silently,
absolutely,
not softly.
So it could be the Rosh, could be the Rosh had a different opinion. Could be. Afilu mashma la'oznov lekala mechish. He says, even if he hears his voice, it's not a problem. It's no worse than tefillah if you hear your voice where your tefillah is still acceptable. So, however, the Taz argues with the reeling of the Rosh and the Shulchan Aruch, claiming that there's no problem of a bracha levatala since we apply the principle of Shomer Ka'oneh. So we didn't have to wait for the Mishnah Berurah. The Taz wrote 300 years ago. So we call makom tzarich likros kach kosev beis Yosef b'shem harosh. That means he couldn't. The Ola cannot rely that he shouldn't have a bracha b'atola based on the reading of the Baal Koreh. Says the Taz utmueli. It's a wonder. Ha'isa b'toisefta v'Yushama b'Mordechai perik b'nei ha'ir mevia ma'asav Rab Meir shekar miyushav beis hakneses shel Tivon. Rab Meir was called to read a Megillah in Tivon. Somebody else made the bracha. I don't understand. Kriyas Megillah, the guy who reads Megillah needs to make the bracha. When Rav Meir heard, he gave a kibbut to somebody to make the bracha, but by hearing it, it's as if he said it. Shomer kekoire, im kain Lama lo nema kan bezeh kendach mavarch v'chazon korei. So we can say by every aliyah, when a guy comes up who doesn't know how to read, so he's going to hear it from the Baal Korei, Shomer Ka'oneh, it's not a bracha levatala. And he brings a siyua mizeh. He brings a support, L'mashakos of Beis Yosef, B'Shem Ha'agud of Nimuke Yosef, which we learned tonight. The Summa Shamer B'Perak HaKorei, Oy Midena Kor B'Torah Ainu Mishum Dein Kor Al Peh. He shouldn't read by heart. Avol Uk Milin Shachrin Shapoisech V'Roeh. Somebody else stands next to him who sees Vasuma Mavorech V'Oy B'Tzido Shapir Dami. Right, so it's like he's making the bracha for the person who's going to read. So that guy is, the reading is being done. There's no bracha levatala. Now, isn't a summa apostle Torah? But there's hamatirim v'hiskim la'oishev. V'chein pasuk b'simin kuf lamed v'chosel b'levush sharab b'fnei gdolim sha'ala summa l'Torah. He also saw a blind person get an aliyah. V'chein kas of Mori Chosni, his father-in-law, who I believe was the Shach. Right? I think the Taz was the son-in-law of the Shach. He made a condition that he should be a Talmid Chacham. However, he says since there are Rishonim that allowed it, must be they allowed it also because of Shomer Ka'oneh. In essence, then, the Taz agrees with the Maril and those who utilize the concept of Shomer Ka'oneh to explain why someone who's blind can get an aliyah. It would seem, though, that the Rosh Tur Beis Yosef all feel that Shomer Ka'oneh is not applicable in this context. It is interesting that despite Rav Yosef's Karo, Chumrah, a stringent ruling on this matter, the Beis Yosef himself does apply the principle of Shomer Ka'oneh regarding Kriyas Torah to explain that the one receiving the aliyah need not read aloud with the Baal Korei. Says the Beis Yosef on Orach Chaim, the Kivan did Livrei Zohar, Asr Likros Ele Echad Levad. There's a Kabbalistic thing that two people should not read. Now that we have a Baal Korei, Ha'ola Asr Likros. The Ola should not read. Even though the poskim said if he doesn't read, it's a bracha levatala. Says the Beis Yosef, but that was never written in the Gemara itself. So lo shavkin and divrei Zohar, divrei poskim. We don't set aside Kabbalistic teachings because of the poskim who had a problem with the guy being silent and having a bracha levatala. Interesting. He relies more on the mystical issues. So here's the Yosef Karo himself, 200 years before the Taz, invoking Shomer Ka'oneh. He quotes the source from Sukkah. He doesn't want the Ola to say anything. He thinks it could fulfill it with Shomer Ka'oneh, and by reading together, you have this Kabbalistic problem of two people reading.
But you know, Ernie, that in the translation, he says aloud. Therefore, the person who receives an aliyah must be careful not to read aloud.
Okay.
So
and we brought, and the Shulchan Aruch, in Chanami, the Shulchan Aruch himself eventually said, Tzorech likros benachas shelo yasmi ela ozna. So in Chanami, this is the Beis Yosef on the tour that he wrote. So if you see, eventually, when he paskined halacha, he paskined that he should read it. If, according to the Beis Yosef, the Ola does fulfill his obligation for reading the Torah through listening to the Baal Korei. By the way, the footnote notes what Yaakov just said. In addition, it is interesting that as we saw above, the Shulchan Aruch rules that the Ola should recite the words quietly along with the Baal Korei. If Shomer Ka'oneh was entirely applicable, this would not be necessary either. So this aspect of the rule of Shulchan Aruch is not addressed directly by Rav Yaakov Emden, who we're going to have right now, Rav Yaakov Emden, who's going to resolve some of these problems. So if, according to Beis Yosef, the Oled does fulfill his obligation for reading the Torah through listening to the Baal Korei, like we just learned, why then does he rule in the Shulchan Aruch that a blind person may not receive an aliyah? Right? If Shomer Ka'oneh works, it should work for a summa. In addition, how will Rav Karo respond to the proof of the Taz that appears to support allowing a blind person to receive an aliyah? So Rav Yaakov Emden in the Yavitz explains that Rav Yaakov Emden lived right after the period of Shabtai Tzvi. So you're talking about, late 1600s, early 1700s. And remember Rav Yaakov,
I think he actually died in 1776, and I only remember that because he died at the year that America declared its independence.
right. So but remember, Rav Emden had a major machlokas with the other major gadol in his generation, who they thought was a Sabbatean, was a follower of Shabtai Tzvi. The
Yonasan Eibeshitz, no?
Rav Yonasan Eibeshitz, exactly. So Rav Yaakov and Rav Yonasan Eibeshitz battled. Rav Yonasan Eibeshitz was, according to most research, was not a Sabbatean, and we rely a lot on Rav Yonasan Eibeshitz's halachic rulings. But anyway,
you should discuss that with Stevie Weiss. He has modern day scholars who looked at all of the works of Rav Yonasan Eibeshitz and came up with different conclusions.
well, yes, there are those that feel that he had some aspects of that, but the Rav Yonasan Eibeshitz is learned in yeshivas and is accepted by when the halachic authorities quote Rav Yonasan Eibeshitz all the time.
Agreed.
So, what does Rav Yaakov Emden try? How does he resolve this issue that we've raised with the Beis Yosef? Ki mayi tenu ma yosif l'suma. What is the benefit or a loss to the summa im yedina ka'ona? If we're going to use the summa, if we're going to use shomei ka'ona, halo einu elo ona al peh. He's doing it without reading. The ikra isra machmas dvarim shebichsav she'atar rishayim bal peh. The problem with the summa we said before was you're not supposed to read things by heart. You're supposed to read it from the klaf. Forget about a blind person. You as the Baal Korah have to be very careful to read without by heart. You have to read it from the letters. Even though he knows it by heart. And when you're doing a kriya b'tzibur with a bracha, it's got to be done with proper reading, without by heart. Those that wanted to say that a summa will be okay with shomei ka'ona ain't a moil. That doesn't help. It'll only help for somebody who is sighted, haroah b'sefer Torah, who can read, who would be able to read if the Baal Korah reads in front of him. In that situation, we'll say he can listen and be quiet because he has the ability to see. And it's as if since the Baal Korah reads it, it's as if he read it. Through this mechanism, because he's reading along with the Baal Korah. He's silent, but he can see the words. So there's no reading Baal Peh. Says the Yaakov Emden, that doesn't work by a blind person. It's a phenomenal chidush. Why should, just because he hears it, since he can't physically see it, it doesn't work as ksiva from the klaf, it's going to be ksiva al pen. That's a problem. In the continuation of the tshuva, Rav Emden explains that the Rosh holds that even one who is not blind may not listen to the Baal Korah without reading along, since Shomei Ka'ona does not apply to Kriyas Torah. Rather, only one who actually reads from the Torah may recite the bracha. Thus, it would seem that he too would agree to the explanation offered in the Bir Halacha on the next source. That gives us a little insight in why the Rosh Paskin, why he did. By the way, there's more detail on page 135 in the Iyun. If someone wants to go into a little bit more detail, and we've been into it, we've done a lot of good Lumdis learning tonight, but there's a little bit more if you want. Now, the Bir Halacha is the part of the Mishnah Brura where the Chafetz Chaim goes to town a little bit. On certain halachas, he goes into depth, a little lomdis, and that's the Bir Halach. So the Bir Halach responds to the question of the Taz. What question are we dealing with? That means, why should you have a problem with Bracha Levatala if you have Shomei Ka'ona? So the Bir Halach responds to the question of the Taz in a different manner than the Yavitz. According to the Bir Halach, Shomei Ka'ona does not apply to Kriyas HaTorah at all within the view of the Rosh and the Shulchan Aruch. The reason is, and this is what we alluded to earlier tonight, is that the entire institution of Kriyas HaTorah is for the tzibur. The obligation of the brachos applies only to the one actually reading the Torah, not one who listens to the Baal Koreh, who has the same status as everybody else. That means the person who's called to an aliyah, he has an obligation to make a bracha. This explains then why the Shulchan Aruch rules that one who is blind may not recite an aliyah, why receive an aliyah, and why he rules that one who receives an aliyah must read along with the Baal Koreh. According to the Bir Halacha, Shomei Ka'ona can only be relied upon with regard to one who is blind, since otherwise he will be shamed that he can never receive an aliyah. But all others must read along with the Baal Koreh themselves quietly, as ruled by the Shulchan Aruch. As for the question of the Taz, he suggests Shomei Ka'ona may be used for Megillah, since each individual is obligated for the Kriya. But for Kriyas HaTorah, the Ola has the same status as the rest of the congregation listening, who do not recite a bracha. Therefore, the Ola must recite the bracha himself. The Bir Halacha also explains that in his opinion, the Ramon Mariel hold that Shomei Ka'ona can only be relied upon with regard to one who is blind, since otherwise he will be ashamed that he can never receive an aliyah. But all others must read along. Says the Bir Halacha, Levatola, I am the Mishnah Berurah, V'nei lefi mad the pasuk haRamah le'el, the Siman Kuf, the way the Ramah Paskin, the Noagim likros l'suma v'amaretz. The Ramah already told us that it was a minig to call a blind person an amaretz for an aliyah, af she'ena yochel likros mashatz, even though they can't read with the Baal Koreh. Im kain, haylo lagia gam kan de ledidon afilu imena koreh mashatz shaper dami. So here as well, the Ramah should have commented that even though he can't read along with the shliach tzibur shaper dami v'afshar desmach adel el. Maybe he didn't do it because he relied on what he wrote previously. Yoter loymar. Maybe, says the Mishnah Berurah, to loy somach haRamah divrei Mariel ele ninsuma v'ma'aretz dim loy karm lo'olam meka kisufa tuva. So the Ramah is now saying that maybe the Ramah relied on the Mariel regarding a suma and ma'aretz only, because there are people that otherwise they'll never get an aliyah, it'll be embarrassment. The Gemasel and Su might come to machloikas. But somebody can read, such a person should not rely on Shomei Ka'ona. We see that the Ramah didn't like the Mariel. So, on the other hand, remember the Taz brought the Aguda, the Mukhe Yosef, Mahad Yerushalmi, the Pasuk Gabi Megillah, the Echad Kor V'Echad Mevarech, right? He brought Rav Meir, who read the Megillah, somebody else made a bracha, the Shomei Ka'ona. V'ken Hiksha Pri Chadash. There was another commentary on the Torah al Shulchan Aruch Ma Yerushalmi Hazeh. Manias Daiti, says the Chafetz Chaim, Pashut Adinam HaRishonim Shechmiru B'zeh. He says the din should follow the Rishonim who were machmir, who didn't allow a summa. It's not similar to what the Yerushalmi said about Rav Meir, Demari Le'ini Megillah L'Kriyas HaTorah. The Shani also Megillah Deminadin Kol HaTzibur Tzrichin L'Kros. Like we said before, Kriyas HaMegillah is the din of Kriya. Everybody in the audience has to read and make the bracha. Kol echad ve'echad b'fnei atzmo. And that's why on Megillah, Echad Mavarch L'Kulam, the Baal Koreh makes the bracha. Everybody listens Shomei Ka'ona because they have to read it themselves. They have to listen to every word of the Megillah. Lotzia Masha'en Kein Hacha. They ain't not Tzibur Rishoyin Levarch Birchas HaTorah. There's no union of Birchas HaTorah for the people sitting in the audience. Al Shmiyosam, the bracha is not the pater, the Tzibur Bichlal. All they have to do is listen to Torah. Ela koire hu amavarach. The one who is called up to read in the Torah, he makes the bracha. V'imken kishena kor ba'atzmo, if he's not the one reading, eno ela kashar anseyat shibur sheshoimim. So he sits and listens like the other people in the shul. Imken ech r'shai levarech hagabi shoimim lo yitiken rabbanan bracha b'kris haTorah. So he doesn't understand. He's like somebody else. Since the people in the audience don't have a chiyuv bracha, why does he have a bracha? He says everybody made their own birchas haTorah in the morning. So, to summarize, the Rosh Rash Batur and Shulchan Aruch hold that the Olam must read along with the Baal Korah in all cases. Consequently, one who is blind or cannot read may not receive an aliyah. The Mariel Ramah Taz Bir Halacha hold that one may be lenient in the case of a blind person, where the Taz says that it's due to Shomei Ka'ona, which would apply to others as well. While the Bir Halacha holds that it's due to the unique considerations of embarrassment. Now, the question of how to apply these opinions to our situation of COVID, where the person can see but cannot approach the Sefer Torah due to social distancing, that will be discussed. Let's begin that tonight. We saw the ruling of the Tosefta in Yerushalmi quoted by the Rosh above, that if only one person can read the Torah, that person can receive 7 aliyot himself and recite the brachos 7 times. The Rosh claimed that this ruling supported his contention that the Olam must read along together with the Baal Koreh. And this ruling is recorded in the Shulchan Aruch. Kuf Mem Gimel, Beit HaKnesset Shein Be'am Ish Yodeh Likrot Ele Echad, a shul that only has one Baal Koreh, nobody else can read. Yivarach v'yikra k'tzas psukim, he should make a bracha, read some psukim, v'yivarach lachreim, and make the bracha afterwards. V'choyzer levarach tchila, and then say the new bracha. The korek tzas psukim v'yivarach lachreim. V'chen yasa kama pamim k'mispar oilim shelo yiso hayom. So the Baal Koreh can have all the aliyahs. This ruling of the Shulchan Aruch appears to be consistent with his other rulings above, that one who cannot read or one who is blind may not receive an aliyah and listen to the Baal Koreh. But would the Maril and the Ramah, who permit somebody who is blind to receive an aliyah, hold that in this case as well, even if only one person can read, the other individuals who cannot read, because they're standing 6 feet away, right? Either due to illiteracy or due to a physical handicap, maybe the Baal Koreh should be called up 7 regular aliyah, or would they agree with the, no. Can other individuals who cannot read be called up at 7 regular aliyah, or would they agree with the ruling of the Shulchan Aruch that it's still preferable to call one person who knows how to read to receive all the aliyah? The Mishnah Berurah addresses this question, claiming that in this situation, 7 aliyot should be given to other individuals according to the Ramah. Let's say you have people that can't read after the Baal Koreh. Mila b'mila, mitoch haktzah. Somebody doesn't read Hebrew very well. Because of Sham, if the person who's had the aliyah cannot really read well, he shouldn't be called. Zelo yale. This practice, where you always call 7 people, the Ramah says you can call up Amoritz, even if he cannot read. So based on this, you should always call 7 people to the Torah. Thus in the case where only one person can read from the Torah, the others can recite the bracha, but are unable to read. The Shulchan Aruch holds that one person should receive all the aliyot, read the entire parsha himself. But the Mishnah Berurah holds that the Ashkenazic practice would be to call up 7 aliyot who will recite the bracha themselves. But the Baal Koreh will fulfill their obligation to read for them, rather than them reading along quietly themselves. So we've seen so far how the poskim of previous generations dealt with cases of a person who could not follow along with the Baal Koreh. They couldn't see, they had failing eyesight, they didn't know how to read Hebrew. So they have heterim to have aliyahs. How does this situation compare to our current reality, where you cannot follow the Baal Koreh because you can't stand next to the Baal Koreh? You have to be 6 feet away. So the Shuvas van Hagos, the Moadim Uzmanim of Moshe Sternbuch, who's one of the contemporary Gdolim today, wrote a tshuva regarding porch minyanim, where people were forbidden to come to the porch where the Sefer Torah was being read. He permitted people receiving aliyot and reciting brachot from their porches, even though they were not able to see the reading inside, due to the principle of Shomei HaKaona. Each person should stand on his own porch. People could see each other. For the first aliyah, either the Balkora goes up or Acher and some or other people in that house, right, who are quarantining with that person. After them, you can invite other neighbors in the other porches, even though the distance, they can't look in the Sefer Torah. The Summa Yochel Alas L'Torah L'Didei, Avshin Akor B'Torah, who held that a blind person could be called up, even though he can't read. And the Ola doesn't have to read along because by listening, he's koine. The whole meaning that we have, that a person who goes up to the Sefer Torah, l'das hagra, haynu mishum kavod haTorah. Technically, you could stand at your seat and make the bracha there. And the reading that you hear from the Balkore, you will be yotze through Shomei Kohen, you don't have to read along with him. According to Rav Sternbuch, the conclusion of the Mishnah Berurah, based on the gross side at the end of the previous section, is that when necessary, when anyone may receive an aliyah, and if they cannot read, due to Shomei Ka'ona, as opposed to the Bir Halacha, which indicated that this allowance is limited only to embarrassment, and social distancing does not pose a problem with that. However, Rav Asher Weiss disagrees. And we're going to save the machlokes of Rav Asher Weiss and the other modern poskim, including Rav Willig, for next week. But I think we covered a lot of ground tonight and also laid a lot of foundations for our understanding of how Kriyas Torah operates. Any other questions, ha'aros, comments?
Yes, a question for you, Ernie. If somebody is on a separate porch and is called up for aliyah according to Rav Sternbach's decision, does that person read along by looking in a chumash that he's holding, or does he just mimic the Baal Koreh by repeating after him?
He doesn't have to repeat after him. He doesn't have to repeat after him. We heard through
Shomei
Ka'ona. Yeah, of course he could read along, but even if he didn't read along, he would be yotze through Shomei Ka'ona. It's a lot better to read along. You would see the words, you know what he's saying, etc.
Okay, Shkaya.
Oh, yeah.